this is pretty much a fake rose that seems to be blooming. It's really simple to create and is not realistic in any way, but can help fool the eye. So if you want to learn how to create this, we'll be learning that in this particular video. So in our default scene, we're gonna press X to delete our default cube. Then we'll press Shift A and we're gonna use a UV sphere to create this particular effect. Once you've added in the UV sphere, you can press 1 to go into the front view, zoom in and press Tab to go into edit mode. Now you can switch on transparency by pressing this button up here and then double tap A to deselect everything. Then you can just select all of the vertices in the top half of this sphere and press X delete vertices so that you're left with just the bottom half. Now the rest of it comes from modifiers. So we'll go back to object mode by using this button or pressing tab to toggle in and out, after which we'll go to the modifier properties by pressing this button. Then we'll add in a solidify modifier and just increase the thickness to maybe something like 0.03 so that you get a little bit of thickness. After that, we can go ahead and add in a subdivision surface modifier to just smoothen things out, and we can increase the levels on the render all the way to 5 to make it very smooth when it gets rendered. But for now, in the viewport, if we crank it up to something like 5, it'll start getting laggy really soon. So we'll keep it down at 1 itself. Now the next problem is that if you actually look at these edges, to see it better you can switch off X-ray mode. You'll see that the lip is actually very sharp. As you increase the level of views, you see it gets really sharp. You may be fine with that. In case you're not and you want it to have a fatter lip, you can just press tab to go into edit mode, press Ctrl Alt to add in a loop cut, click once and just lift it up till it comes right to that edge, and that way it gets this really nice bevel while retaining that thickness. Once you're happy with that, you can tab back out into object mode and decrease the levels in the viewport down to 1. Next up, we can modify this shape to make it more like the petals. For that, we'll press tab to go into edit mode and we'll press O to switch on proportional editing, or we can toggle this button up here, and we'll also go to edge select mode by pressing this button or hitting the number 2. Then we'll press 7 to go into the top view and just select 4 opposite edges by pressing shift and selecting them. So now you have these 4 edges selected. Make sure that no extra edges are selected. Like here, I accidentally selected this, so just deselect it and then press GZ to lift it up. Now you can always play around with the influence by increasing and decreasing the slider size, but I'll leave the size at the default 1 for now and just bring these up a little bit. Along with that, I'm going to select this bottommost vertex by switching to vertex select mode by pressing this button and then just selecting it and grabbing it up on the Z-axis as well by pressing GZ and lifting it up. So once you've done that, you can press tab to go back into object mode and also go to object, set shade smooth. Now you can press shift A to add in an empty plane axis, and this is going to act as the object for your array modifier. So let's select the sphere again. In the modifiers panel, add in a new array modifier and go down to it and change the relative offset to an object offset by de-checking relative offset and selecting object offset, then expanding it, and for the object we can select the empty. Now you can increase the count to something like 12, and then when you take the empty and scale it up by the least amount, you can start seeing how it comes in. So for now, I'll scale it up by 1.1 units, and this is what we have. Now it might not look like a rose at all, but this portion requires a little bit of playing around and you will eventually get something that resembles a rose. What you do is select the empty and press R twice so that we get a trackball rotation method. And then if you just rotate the mouse around randomly, you can see how it rotates about randomly. Now make sure that you don't go too crazy with it like what I've done just to demonstrate the purposes. Press R twice. Make sure you control the movement by pressing shift and just give it some wacky rotations. And you can just play around with this and keep rotating it, and you'll eventually reach scenarios where it starts looking quite like a rose. For example, this already looks a little bit like a rose to me. However, there's quite a bit of clipping happening. However, most of this clipping won't be that noticeable, so it's actually fine. You can always select the original sphere and just rotate it a little bit here and there to remove the clipping. So as you can see, I just rotated it a bit and now most of the clippings are gone, and this seems all right for my rose-like structure. Now you can go ahead and select a nice position for your camera, or you can play around a little bit more with the randomness. And of course, remember, you can get really cool effects just by this itself. You can animate the position of the empty and get really cool sci-fi looking effects based on how you texture this. But for now, I guess I'll go with something like this. maybe play around with the scale as well and the rotation of the original object just to prevent this clipping. And I feel like this looks like the perfect rose for me, but I also don't need the last one or two instances created from the array modifier. So I'm just going to select it, go to the array modifier and just decrease the count to maybe 10. And this seems good enough for the rose. Now we can actually start off the animation. For that, the first thing is selecting and deciding how our camera is going to be placed. So just get a really nice zoomed in look, because if you go too far out, the shape actually ruins the illusion of the rose. So I think when it's zoomed in, it looks a lot better. Just zoom in and then press Ctrl Alt numpad 0 to snap the camera to the current view. Then you can select the camera and just change the transform orientations from global to local, and then press GZ to bring it back out a little bit. Maybe do some GY to bring it up, and then go to the camera properties down here and go to viewport display and increase passport out all the way to 1 so that nothing outside the camera view is seen. Then you can switch off overlays and go to the viewport shading of rendered, and you see this is what our final look is like. Then you can select the original sphere object and set all of our animation defaults. So let's go to the output properties, change our frame rate to 30 frames per second. End frame is going to be 150 so that it's a 5-second long animation. Output folder can be wherever you want it to be. File format is going to be FFmpeg video. Encoding has to be changed from Matroska to MPEG-4 with an output quality of perceptually lossless. Then you can go to the object data properties over here, and we're going to add in 2 shape keys. So first up, we press the plus to add in a new base shape key, then press plus to add in a new key, press tab, select the 4 edges that you had selected. So you can press 0 to go out of the camera view and just select them. So this is one, shift select the second one, the third one, and the fourth one is on this side. Once you have that, go back to your camera view and just scale it down to make it seem like the rose is closing. Now, of course, you can also grab it on the Z-axis. You can play around with it by even rotating it around. That will help you hide some areas that are getting clipped as well. But I'm not going to do any of that for today. I'm just going to scale it down and leave it as is. But you can play around with this to get exactly what you want. And then you can tab back out to go into object mode, and immediately everything becomes normal because it gets stored into key 1. If you increase the value, it goes into that closed shape. And then if you decrease it, it comes back out to the open look. So this is what we're going to keyframe. So let's start off by changing the value to 1 and then hovering over it and pressing I. Then we can go all the way to frame 150 and just change the value all the way to 0, hover over it and tap I. That way, you get the animation of it slowly opening. And it's set to Bezier, which means it's slow at the beginning, speeds up in the middle, and slows down at the end. And I think that's perfectly all right for this particular animation. After that, we can start off the actual texturing. So to do that, we'll change our viewport display to rendered, and we'll select our light and press delete to remove it. Then we'll set all of our rendered defaults, which is going to the render properties, switching on ambient occlusion, expanding it, and we're actually going to increase the distance to something like 1, and I'll increase the factor as well to something like 5, after which I'm going to switch on screen space reflections as well. Then I'm going to go to the world properties and change the color all the way to the brightest white there is, and I'm going to finally select the sphere, go to the material properties here, give it a new material, or just give it the default material because that's not being used for anything else. And you can change the base color to whatever you want. I'm going to go with a very slight reddish color or a pinkish color. I'll go with reddish today. And I'm going to increase the metallicness to maybe 0.9 and reduce the roughness down to 0.3, switch off overlays. And this is what we currently have. I think that looks perfect. And it's a really quick and easy way to create something that looks fairly complex and resembles a rose. Apart from that, if you want the background to be something else, you can just press Shift A to add in a mesh plane. Then to actually get the plane to be oriented correctly, you can go to the object constraint properties and add in a copy rotation constraint. And for the target, you can choose camera, and immediately it'll always be oriented correctly. Now you can just scale it up and then press GZ. Remember, we have local coordinates enabled. So Z is going to push it back, scale it up, and then give it a new material and change that base color to whatever you want. You want it to be slightly contrasty, you can go up towards the blue. You want it to be relatively the same, you can give it that same peachish color except a lot more desaturated, or maybe a new pinkish color. If you want it to be like, oh, it's a rose in the field, you can give it some desaturated green. Most colors work in this particular situation, so it's up to you to choose what you want the background color to be. In my case, I'm just going to use a desaturated peach itself or a bluish color for the contrast. So I'll make the decision just before hitting the render, and that's the file that you'll get on Patreon if you want to test it out by yourself. And with that, The final render or renders look like this. Thank you so much for watching, and I think this was a fairly simpler one, but the aim of the video was to demonstrate that using simple shapes, you can actually create things that resemble other objects without having to go through the intricate details of actually modeling a rose, which would have been much harder. There are various other methods of creating roses, but I've never seen somebody use a method like this. So if that helped you, be sure to leave a like and comment down your questions, queries, suggestions, or anything else below. And until the next video comes out, which is definitely going to be tomorrow, keep creating and stay creative.